Hello and welcome back to All About Russia. My name's Andrew and today we're going to be looking at one of the titular nations of the Kabardino-Balkaria Republic, the Balkars. The Balkars, known in their native tongue as Malkalila, which translates to something roughly like mountaineers, are a small ethnic group located in the Kabardino-Balkaria Republic. This republic is their native land, and due to, shall we say, an interesting administrative change in the past, they share this republic with the Kabardians, an Adygia or Circassian ethnic group. As of the 2010 census, there are over 100,000 Balkars in the Kabardino-Balkaria Republic, which is only around 12% of the total population of that republic. Furthermore, they only make a majority in the Elbrus and Terek districts. Negligible numbers of Balkars can be found across the Russian Federation, yet due to historic reasons significant numbers can be found in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan and oddly the United States. We will explain this a little later in the video. The name Balkar is an exonym, a name given to them by others. There are two main theories as to where this name came from. Firstly, it may be a corruption of Malkar, as a primary residency of the Balkar people is the Malkar Gorge. The other prominent theory is that the term Balkar is a corruption of Bolgar, being the descendant of the Bulgars of the Volga region. Whatever the truth of the matter, the name has stuck, and has even found its way into the name of their shared republic. The Balkars are a Turkic ethnic group, and speak a mutually understandable language as the Karaches, a neighbouring ethnic group, which are seen by some as part of the same ethnic group. Their language is called Karachi-Balkar. Interestingly, this language is actually incredibly similar to Kumyk, another neighbouring language spoken by another neighbouring Turkic ethnic group. In fact, one could go so far as to claim that Karachi, Balkar and Kumyk are all dialects of the same language. Karachi-Balkar is in the Kuman Kipchak branch of the Turkic family tree. Traditionally, the language did not have a written form, but used an Arabic script from the 17th century onwards, thanks to Ottoman influence. In 1924, this was changed to a Latin script, before finally settling on a Cyrillic script in 1939. For those of you interested, it sounds a little like this.
Dağı da былай айтты.
Bir adamны 2 yaşı bolgandı. Sonra aladan kiçisi atasına, "Atam, mülkten maňa jeterik ülüşnü maňa ber" degendi.
The flag of the Balkars is a blue background with two horizontal white stripes and a pair of white mountains in the centre. The blue signifies the Balkars are Turkic people, whilst the two white stripes represent the heavens and the earth. The two white mountains in the centre are to represent Mount Elbrus, but also are symbolic of the historic ties between the Karaches and the Balkars. The origins of the Balkars are shrouded in mystery and not a little controversy. One narrative, espoused by the Balkars themselves, is that they are of Avanic or Alanian origin, making up one of the peoples of the Kingdom of Alania. Their people were forced to merge with other Alanian groups when the Kipchak Cumans invaded in the 11th century. This process of merging in a mountainous region would be repeated again in the 13th and 14th centuries, when the Mongols again under Tamerlane invaded the region. Eventually, from a blending of the Vanic, Alanian and other ethnic groups, the Turkic Balkar people emerged. However, some other sources, including Kabardian sources, claim that the Balkars are the remnant of the Mongol horde who arrived in the 13th century, they themselves being a Turkic tribe that was riding with the horde. Regardless of how long the Balkars have actually been in the Caucasus for, the arrival of the Mongols in the 13th century brought about not only a Balkar national identity, but also the introduction of Islam. Before this, it can be presumed that the Balkars were either Tengriists like many nomadic people of the 14th century, or were Christians as the Alans had been. The arrival of Tamerlane and growing influence of the Ottomans in the Caucasus brought a wave of conversions to the Balkars, among several other peoples of the Caucasus. According to the Balkars in the 15th century, the Kabardians, one of the Adygia tribes, began migrating and invading into their lands, forcing the Balkars to move to the mountains. The Kabardian narrative is that these lands were either depopulated or lightly held by Mongolian Turkic tribes at the time. Regardless of which narrative is true, a period of coexistence between the Balkars and the Kabardians began in the 15th century, with the Balkars in the southern, more mountainous regions. The Balkars were first introduced to Russia in 1648, when an expedition from Muscovy arrived in Balkaria to prospect silver mining in the region. Sadly, this came to naught, but it did put the Balkars on the diplomatic radar of the rising Russian power. From the 14th through to the 18th centuries, the neighbouring Crimean Khans had raided and demanded tribute in the form of slaves from the people of the Western Caucasus. Despite a strained relationship, in 1708 the Balkars joined with the Kabardians to repel a punitive expedition sent by Khan Kaplan Garay. This force was annihilated and left the Balkars free to pursue their own struggles against their larger neighbour. When the Russians returned to the Caucasus, attempting to subdue the length of the Caucasus Mountains, the Balkars were in no mood for a fight and agreed to neutrality during a parley in 1826. This lasted for 2 years, before accusations of Balkar fighters among the Circassian armies fighting the Russians prompted Russian military units to enter the Malkar Gorge. In the Battle of Kasauka in 1828, Russian troops burned Balkar villages and forced the Balkar elders to submit themselves to the Tsar. This arrangement was largely nominal, and the existing hierarchy in Balkar society was left intact, though the show of force was no doubt there to serve as a reminder and threat to the Balkar people that the rising power of Russia was in charge. With the end of the Caucasian Wars in the late 1860s, more Russian influence and investment in Balkaria was made. Over the next 40 years, new schools and roads were established, enabling the Balkar community to learn Russian and move across the region more easily. This period arguably marked the beginning of a distinct Balkar identity, separate from the Karachi or wider Turkic identity. This too saw a small but influential intelligentsia grow within the Balkar community. However, despite all this is not to say that the Russian influence was entirely welcomed, and a flight to the Ottoman Empire was made by many Balkars in that same decade. In 1914, with the start of the First World War, the anti-Muslim laws prevented many Balkars from joining the Russian army. Thus, when the Tsar abdicated and both the provisional government and Bolshevik forces came to power, the Balkar community was torn. Pro-Bolshevik, provisional government and independent sentiments ravaged the Balkar community, and whilst nominally part of the Mountainous Republic of the Northern Caucasus in 1917, they had accepted Bolshevik rule by 1921. It is worth mentioning that they, like many of the people of the Caucasus, accepted this rule at the end of a bayonet. The following year, the Balkars were mixed with the Kabardians into the Kabardino-Balkaria autonomous region. This decision was made in part from pre-existing administrative borders, but also to separate the Balkars from their ethnic kin, the Karachis. This was because whilst the Red Army had established itself as a great power in the Caucasus, it was not without opposition, and thus sought a divide and rule strategy. Soviet policies for collectivization and religious repression came as a shock to the remote mountainous people. Mosques were destroyed or converted to other uses, and their language, whilst promoted, gradually declined in importance among the younger Soviet generation. Furthermore, over 17,000 Balkars were tried for various anti-Soviet behaviour during the late 1920s and early 1930s, giving the Balkars, at least in Stalin's eyes, an air of unreliability. Soviet rule was not entirely bad, however. An introduction of welfare assistance, literacy programs for both the Balkar and Russian languages, as well as modern infrastructure, helped integrate the Balkars into the wider Soviet community, allowing for the first time the Balkars the opportunity to live and work across the former Tsarist Empire. With the start of the Second World War, thousands of Balkars signed up to fight in the Red Army and help in the factories of the Soviet Union. However, despite this, the German war machine was able to capture Nalchik, the capital of the Kabardino-Balkaria SSR. This was the last straw in the eyes of Stalin, who had dim views of the Balkars going back to the 1920s and saw this as the pinnacle of traitorous actions. The fact that Nalchik had been taken by some of the most elite units in the Nazi-aligned Romanian army was apparently inconsequential. When the region had been recovered by 1944, the Balkars, men, women and children, were rounded up and deported to Central Asia. Returning Balkar troops were disarmed and deported too, leaving Balkaria devoid of its namesake ethnic group. Their land was divided between Kabardian and Georgian settlers, and the name Balkar dropped from the republic. Thousands died en route to the deserts of Central Asia, and by the time they were permitted to return in 1956 under Khrushchev, an estimated fifth of all Balkars had died in their exile. This deportation was a watershed moment in Balkar history for several reasons. Firstly, the breaking up and murder of entire villages fundamentally changed the way the Balkars viewed the Soviet state. Their time in Central Asia, among other Turkic and more traditionally Islamic ethnic groups, had the inadvertent effect of renewing Islamic teachings among the Balkars, who were now devoid of the means of a state education, who then came back in 1956 with a renewed devotion and ideology, one largely at odds with communism. Secondly, among the NKVD forces were several thousand Kabardian auxiliaries who, after helping deport the Balkars, began living in their homes and farming their land. Understandably, this created a rift between the two ethnic groups supposed to share the republic together. A rift which has not really been bridged thus far. Lastly, and most controversially, it forever changed the demographics of the Kabardino-Balkaria Republic, with the Kabardians heavily outnumbering the Balkars henceforth. This is controversial, as some Kabardians claim that this had been the case even before the deportations, that whilst many Balkars died in exile, this did not dramatically change the demographics. Balkar authorities, however, claim that the huge death and diaspora community as evidence that the demographics were more balanced in many parts of the Kabardino-Balkaria SSR, and that they were far more numerous in that republic than they are today. When the Balkars returned in 1956, there was of course some unrest, but this was not to the levels as seen in neighbouring Chechnya. Within a few years, the wider Soviet identity was being pushed on the new generation, yet the fires of Balkar nationalism had not died out. In the 1980s, with the introduction of glasnost, Balkar nationalism began to be raised publicly. Many Balkar communities identified with the pan-Turkic ideas that had been floated around since the 1940s, and increasingly found themselves at odds with their Kabardian neighbours. With the fall of the Soviet Union, greater freedom of expression was permitted. Reveling in their history, religion and shared experiences, it found itself too in a growing demand for unification with their ethnic cousins, the Karaches, or a separation from the Kabardians. Some Balkar leaders even advocated for outright secession from Russia, but in 1996 most of those leaders were arrested. Such sentiments do not suddenly go away, however, and as recently as 2018, clashes have occurred between the Kabardians, who themselves advocate for unification with their ethnic Circassian cousins, and the Balkars, over grazing and ancestral claims to land. Today, most Balkars are Sunni Muslims, as are many of the people of the Northern Caucasus. Their religion is largely tied to their identity, and any vestiges of their pre-Islamic past are few and far between. One of the few that do remain, however, is the Naat epic. The Naat epic is a semi-mythological epic saga known among many of the people of the Northern Caucasus, with varying details. This is a tale depicting mythical warriors of the Caucasus embroiled in wars with each other and monsters. As before stated, the Naat epic is not unique to the Balkars, but they do have their own unique version of it. Music often accompanies retellings of the Naat epic, and music plays a hugely important role in Balkar society, with instruments such as the kobuz, zurna and sibizki. Traditional Balkar clothing follows a pattern seen across much of the Caucasus. For men, a military garb of a burqa over shirt and overcoats, yet for the women, decorative dresses, often in red for younger women and green for elder, were popular, with headscarves and shawls of Iranian influence very predominant as well. Of course, modern Balkars wear modern clothing, and these traditional clothes are often reserved for special occasions and festivals. Being a pastoral people, dairy and meat play large parts of the Balkar diet, with the national dish of gichin, a dough pie made with various fillings. The Balkars are an interesting but often overlooked people of the Russian Federation. Theirs is a story of trial and tribulation, but one they have arguably come out stronger for. My name's Andrew, and thank you for watching. Up next are the Bashkirs. Paka!